Hello. Oh my god, dude. Have I been talking without hearing me? Oh my god. Let me recap. I almost relapsed Wednesday. I know, Tuesday. I was supposed to do chest, but I'm too sore because I tried a higher rep with my biceps. Tuesday. Um, no, Wednesday. I want to do like a comeback. I did some jogging while working, and then on Thursday and Wednesday I was gonna insert the chest as well. Whole afternoon, I didn't do anything. Instead, I opened up an old game called AFK Arena. Thursday, I relapsed hard. A whole day. I didn't even work almost. Thursday. And I was feeling pretty shit. And I prayed that this won't happen. Like, God will guide me. Friday, I broke up the habit. I played for a while at the beginning of the morning, and then I just no, no, I'm gonna go. Hard reset it. I didn't still do workout because I was too late. I had to go work and stuff. Clean my room. Look at my room. It looks good now. Speaking of which, I need to like rearrange it. And now Saturday, day 74. Fuck. Gonna do biceps. Unfortunately, I didn't make it. I had to do the bicep and chest set again for the second one. But all in all, I only missed like the chest workout because I got to do the cardio for this week. The only thing I also regret is that throughout the whole week I didn't get to do my quota for programming, which is to go back into basics of React. That's supposed to be the deal. I didn't do it. But yeah, next week I will be finishing off VMLI's functionalities, giving databases to like the tenants and stuff. I'll try to find a way to integrate Stripe or Gcash or whatever in the application, but I'm not really sure because Gcash doesn't really do that. Maybe it's a link, like click here to pay through Gcash or whatever. I don't know. I don't know. Anyways, what else? What else? Yeah, gotta work out now. Pray to God, guys. He'll guide you. Anyways, I also was saying that never mind. I drink my vitamins. I drink my um caffeine tablet, not the energy drink thingy. Just a literally just a tablet, like you drink it like a medicine. And then I have my writing list strip on. So, and I'm gonna listen to podcasts. I don't know if you're listening with me because I'm. It's in my own pace, bro. Like, but yeah, I'm doing 4 things at once. Yeah, let's go. Widening workout, streaming, listening to podcasts. That's pretty cool, right? Yeah. Oh, and sunlight. I need sunlight, so that's vitamin. Oh, is that apparently raises my cortisol levels in inappropriate amounts. Pretty good. Anyways, so 5 things at once that doesn't matter. Oh shit, word. Anyways, let's go work out, guys. Oh, I'm feeling a bit dizzy. Oh my god, I think it's the caffeine. Oh my lord. Yeah, there's definitely something fucking around in my stomach. I feel sick, man. I'm about to puke. What?
Long and quite comprehensive. So this review, Psychology of Habit, by Wood and Runger, is excellent. And here I'm more or less paraphrasing from them, so I want to be clear that these are their words, not mine. They're talking about the various ways that habits form in the nervous system, and they mention with each repetition of a habit, small changes occur in the cognitive and neural mechanisms associated with procedural memory. So I just want to talk for a second about what procedural memory is. In the neuroscience of memory, we distinguish between what's called episodic memory and procedural memory. Episodic memory is a recall of a particular set of events that happened, whereas procedural memory is holding in mind the specific sequence of things that need to happen in order for a particular outcome to occur. So think of it like a recipe or a protocol, or if for the sake of exercise, it's like sets and reps, or a particular course that you're going to run or cycle, or the number of laps you're going to swim and how you're going to perform it. It's very clear that for anyone trying to adopt new habits, getting into the mindset of procedural memory is very useful for overcoming.
Hold on.
That barrier that we call limbic friction. How do you do that? Well, a simple visualization exercise, or it doesn't even have to be done eyes closed. Oftentimes we hear visualization exercise. You think about sitting in the lotus position, eyes closed, and trying really hard to visualize something. It doesn't need to be anything like that. It can simply be, if you are deciding to adopt a new habit, to just think about the very specific sequence of steps that's required to execute that habit. And I'll use a trivial example, but this could be applied to anything. Let's say I want to get into the habit of making myself or someone else in my household a cup of espresso every morning. I would actually think through each of those steps, walk into the kitchen, turn on the espresso machine, draw the espresso, walking through each of those steps from start to finish. And it turns out just that simple mental exercise done once can shift people toward a much higher likelihood of performing that habit regularly, not just the first time, but as they continue out into the days and weeks that follow. So that's remarkable to me. And the literature is really robust. Just one mental exercise of thinking through what are the sequence of steps required in order to perform this habit from start to finish can shift the likelihood of being able to perform that habit from unlikely or to moderately likely to very likely over time. And that's because it pulls from this process that involves our hippocampus and our neocortex and other areas of our brain and nervous system that engage in procedural memory. It shifts the brain towards a mindset, if you will. It's more of a neural circuit set, it would be more accurate, but a mindset / neural circuit set of doing things in a particular sequence, which allows that limbic friction to come down and increases the likelihood that we're going to perform that thing. Simple tool, but very powerful tool according to the psychology literature. And actually, the cellular and molecular mechanisms that underlie that sort of procedural memory stepping through phenomenon are known. In this article I mentioned, this beautiful review, they talk about so-called Hebbian learning. Donald Hebb was a psychologist in Canada and birthed this field that has now lasted, more than 50 years and is still very strong in neuroscience and psychology of Hebbian learning. Hebbian learning is when particular neurons are coactive, meaning when they fire together, they tend to strengthen their connections with one another. And it has a number of different underlying cellular and molecular features that we don't have to go into in detail, but for those of you that want to know, I know some of you are hungry for a little bit more neuroscience. This involves things like NMDA receptors, N-methyl D-aspartate receptors. NMDA receptors are really important, I think, for everyone to understand. So I'll just tell you a little bit about them. These are receptors that are on the neuron surface, and normally they don't contribute much to the activity of those neurons. Those neurons are perfectly capable of doing their thing without activation of this NMDA receptor. But when a neuron gets a very strong input, a strong stimulus, that NMDA receptor triggers a number of mechanisms that recruit to the surface of the neuron more other receptors. In other words, it makes that neuron more responsive to input in the future such that it doesn't require so much input. In other words, it takes a neuron that is very unlikely to fire and makes it more likely to fire. So this procedural stepping through of the steps of the recipe or the series of action steps that are involved in sitting down to study and writing for an hour or generating exercise, whatever it is the habit that you're trying to learn, when you're doing that exercise, it's not as if your nervous system thinks you're actually performing the behavior. Your nervous system isn't stupid. It's actually a lot smarter than that. It knows the difference between a thought and an action. But when you do that, it sets in motion the same neurons that are going to be required for the execution of that habit. And so when you actually show up to perform that habit, it's as if the dominoes fall more easily. It's a lower threshold, as we say, in order to get the habit to perform. So Hebbian learning, NMDA receptors, all that nuts and bolts stuff are really the guts of the mechanisms of how this works. But for those of you that just want to be more habitual about certain things, be able to perform certain things more reflexively that you would like in your life, simply take the time, do it once, maybe twice, and just sit down, close your eyes if you like, and just step through the procedure of what it's going to take in order to perform that habit. The psychology literature, as I mentioned, and also the neuroscience literature strongly supports the fact that it is going to make it far easier for you to adopt and maintain that habit. And if you are somebody who used to perform a habit and you don't understand why you dropped it and you're frustrated with yourself and you're trying to figure out how you can get back into that habit, well, by all means, lean right back into that habit. But if you're having trouble doing that, also just use the procedural memory exercise in order to shift your nervous system toward a higher likelihood that you will return to that habit, just the same way I described for trying to initiate a new habit. So now I'd like to discuss a second and what I think is perhaps the most powerful tool for being able to acquire and stick to new habits. This tool is rooted in what we call neural circuits, and I do think it is important to understand a little bit about how those neural circuits work. For those of you that are saying, just tell me what to do, I have to say, as I always say, understanding a little bit or a lot of underlying mechanism will help solidify these concepts for you and will help ensure that the tools that I offer are going to make sense and that they're going to make sense in different contexts and for different types of habits that you're trying to learn. So rather than just tell you what to do, I'm going to tell you how this particular tool works. And then in doing that, you should be able to apply it to any habit under any conditions. The tool that I'm referring to is something called task bracketing. And the neural circuits associated with task bracketing are basically the neural circuits that are going to allow you to learn any new type of habit or break any habit that you'd like to break. We have in our brain a set of neural circuits that fall under the umbrella term of the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are involved in action execution, meaning doing certain things, and action suppression, not doing certain things. In the experimental realm, these are referred to as go, meaning do, or no go, don't do certain things. And some of us fall more into the category of we find it very easy to do certain things, but harder to not do other things. Some people have a lot of no-go type circuits that are very robust, and they have a lot of behavioral constraint, but they have a harder time getting into action. And some people have a perfect balance of both, but I've never met one of those people. So again, drawing from, more or less paraphrasing from this beautiful review that I described earlier in Annual Review of Psychology, by Wood and Runger, task bracketing involves a particular set of neural circuits within the basal ganglia. So I'm going to describe this here, again, paraphrasing, a sensory motor loop. Sensory means just input coming in about sight, sounds, tastes, etc. And then the motor systems, the systems of the brain and body that generate action, taking that information and generating action. So it turns out that there's an area of our basal ganglia called the dorsolateral striatum. We can use the acronym DLS. Again, dorsolateral striatum. Dorso means up, lateral means to the side, so dorsolateral, and striatum is a subdivision of the basal ganglia. And it's very important for the establishment of behaviors that are associated with a habit, but not necessarily the habit itself. And beautiful studies in both animals and humans that record the electrical activity in the dorsolateral striatum find that the dorsolateral striatum is associated, meaning it becomes active at the beginning of a particular habit and at the very end and after a particular habit. Hence the phrase task bracketing. It brackets the habit. Now, other sets of neurons are going to be active during the actual execution of the habit. But what the literature on the dorsolateral striatum tells us is that we have particular circuits in our brain that are devoted to framing the events that happen just before and as we initiate a habit, and just after and as we terminate a habit. In other words, it acts as a sort of marker for the habit execution, but not the execution of the habit per se. Now, this is very important because task bracketing is what underlies whether or not a habit will be context dependent or not, whether or not it will be strong and likely to occur even if we didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, even if we're feeling distracted, even if we are not feeling like doing something emotionally, or if we are, completely overwhelmed by other events. If the neural circuits for task bracketing are deeply embedded in us, meaning they are very robust around a particular habit, well, then it's likely that we're going to go out for that zone 2 cardio no matter what, that we're going to brush our teeth no matter what. In fact, brushing our teeth is a pretty good example because for most people, even if you got a terrible night's sleep, even if everything in your life is going wrong, chances are, unless you're very depressed, if you're going to leave to work or even if you're not, that you're going to still carry out the behavior of brushing your teeth in the morning. I would hope so, actually. But you are probably less likely to perform particular habits that are not what you deem as necessary. But if you think about it, brushing your teeth, exercise, eating particular foods, maybe engaging socially in particular ways, you are the one that places any kind of value assessment on which ones are essential and which ones are negotiable. So task bracketing sets a neural imprint, a kind of a fingerprint in your brain of this thing has to happen at this particular time of day, so much so that it's reflexive. And as we'll talk about in a moment, there's a way that you can build up task bracketing so that regardless of what it is you're trying to learn, there's a much higher probability that you're going to do that thing. And when I say learn, meaning let's say you're trying to acquire a habit that for you is really challenging. Maybe it's that you're going to write for an hour a day on a book project that you've been thinking about, or you're going to work on mathematics, or you're going to do any sort of thing that for you there's a lot of limbic friction. While it is important to think about the sequence of events that would be required in order to engage in that behavior, that procedural memory visualization exercise we talked about before, that will help. There is a way also that you can orient your nervous system toward this task bracketing process so that your nervous system is shifted or oriented towards the execution of a given habit. So this is sort of like warming up your body to exercise. When the dorsolateral striatum is engaged, your body and your brain are primed to execute a habit, and then you get to consciously insert which habit you want to perform. So in order to leverage the neural mechanisms of task bracketing, in order to increase the likelihood that you're going to perform a particular habit, I have to break it to you that one thing that you've probably heard over and over about habit formation is not true. And what I'm referring to is this idea that if you are very specific about exactly when you're going to perform a particular habit, that you are more likely to perform that habit. And while that is true in the short term, it is not true in the long term. And the reason for that is that our nervous system tends to generate particular kinds of behaviors based not on time, but on our state, meaning what level of activation is taking place in our brain and body, how much focus we happen to have, how fatigued we are, how energized we are. So while schedules are important, it's not the specific time of day per se that's going to allow you to get into a habit and form that habit and consolidate that habit. Rather, it's the state that your brain and body are in that's important to anchor yourself to. So now I'm going to offer you a tool. It's actually an entire program by which you can insert particular habits and activities at particular phases of the day, not times of day, but phases of the day, because it turns out that particular phases of the day are associated with particular biological underpinnings, chemicals and neural circuits and so forth. And in doing so, it will make it far more likely that you'll be able to regularly engage in these habits and activities over a long period of time. Now, whether or not that will move you from somebody who ordinarily would take 200 days to form a habit to one of those 18 days to habit people in that earlier study I mentioned, I don't know. But I am certain that it will have a significant shift on allowing you to engage in particular habits more easily and to consolidate those habits more quickly. So the program I'm about to describe, I formulated for you based on the neuroscience literature and the psychology literature of learning and this concept of task bracketing. It involves dividing the 24-hour days into what I call 3 phases. The first is phase 1, which is 0 to 8 hours after waking up. Approximately. Okay, you can put a plus or minus 30 minutes on this for yourself. The second phase is the 9 to 14, maybe 15 hours after you wake up. And the third phase is 16 to 24 hours after waking up. So we've taken the 24-hour cycle, we've carved it up into 3 phases, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Now, everything I'm describing, or at least the way I'm going to describe it, is based on what I would call a typical schedule, diurnal schedule. You've heard of nocturnal? Well, we are diurnal. Most of us are asleep at night and awake during the day. I do realize that a number of people have shift work or they have newborns or other reasons why they have to be up in the middle of the night and sleeping during the day. If that's the case, please listen to the episode that we did on jet lag and shift work because it has a lot of tools specifically for that population. But most people go to sleep somewhere around 10 p.m., plus or minus 2 hours, and wake up sometime around 7 a.m., plus or minus 2 hours. So today I'm going to use the to bed at 10 p.m. and the wake up time of 7 a.m. as the framework for this, but you could adopt it easily to your particular schedule. Phase 1, which again is 0 to 8 hours after waking, has a particular neurochemical signature. Regardless of what you do, the neuromodulators norepinephrine, as well as epinephrine, so that's noradrenaline and adrenaline, as well as the neuromodulator dopamine, tend to be elevated during that first 0 to 8 hours after waking. There are a number of reasons for this related to the fact that also cortisol is higher in our brain and bloodstream. It's a healthy level of cortisol upon waking. Body temperature is increased, etc. And there are several things that perhaps we should all be doing. I've talked about many of these on the podcast before, that in addition to those chemicals, further support an alert and focused state. And I'll just list those off. I've done many podcasts on each of these. If you'd like to access those podcasts, you can find them in the menu of podcasts on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, etc. They involve, for instance, viewing sunlight or bright artificial light if you can't access sunlight within the first 30 minutes of waking, physical exercise of some kind in this first phase of the day, 0 to 8 hours of the day, ideally pretty early in that phase. But, if it has to be at the 7 to 8 hour transition point, that's fine too. Cold exposure in the form of cold showers or ice baths or outside with minimal clothing, appropriate yet minimal clothing. Caffeine ingestion, fasting, for instance, not ingesting calories also will lend itself to increased norepinephrine, dopamine, etc. If you are going to consume foods that are rich in things like tyrosine, which is a precursor for dopamine, you can look up which foods are high in tyrosine. And for those of you that are interested in supplementation and like to use those routes, things like alpha GPC or phenylethylamine or L-tyrosine, if that's in keeping with what you're able to do. Of course, consult your doctor if you're going to rely on supplementation. What's this all about? Well, the already elevated norepinephrine and dopamine, the sunlight, exercise, cold exposure, caffeine, tyrosine, etc., all of those place the brain and body into a state in which you are better able, or I would say more easily able, to engage in activities that have a high degree of limbic friction and where you need to override that limbic friction, right? We've heard that the morning is kind of sacred, conquer the hardest things first thing in the morning, and that's been discussed in the pop psychology literature and in the habit formation literature merely from the perspective of get it out of the way so you can feel good about having done it. But what I'm referring to is quite different. What I'm referring to is a particular phase of day that after rising, after waking up that is, for 0 to 8 hours, right, in that first phase, your whole system is action and focus oriented. And we know that when you are action and focus oriented, and because of the neurochemicals that are naturally released into your brain and body, that you will be more likely to overcome any limbic friction that stands in the way of performing particular habits. So as you list out or think about the various habits that you'd like to adopt in your life, take the habits for which you know there's the highest degree of limbic friction. They are the hardest for you to engage in. They require the most activation energy, and put those in this 0 to 8 hours after waking. This will greatly facilitate your performance of those new habits. I'm certain of that. And in addition to that, by doing them in this particular phase of the day, not necessarily at the same time. I mean, if you want to be very habitual and you want to do, the exercise or the sunlight viewing always at the same time, or you want to do, you want to drink your caffeine always at the exact same time, that's fine. But by placing them in this broader window of 0 to 8 hours after waking, what you're doing is you're creating task bracketing. You're making it such that your nervous system will predict when you are going to lean in against limbic friction in order to perform particular types of habits. And this is very different than saying, I'm always going to run or I'm always going to study from 10 to 12 a.m. every morning. That's great, and if you can do that, terrific. But the literature indicates that people who do that, who are very rigid about when they do things, tend, because of context dependence, to not necessarily stick to those habits over time. Some people do, but many, many people don't. So think about the hardest habits to form and the habits that you most want to form that are hardest for you to adopt and to maintain. And I highly suggest placing those somewhere within this phase 1 of 0 to 8 hours after waking. Now, of course, some of the things I listed out, sunlight viewing, exercise, cold exposure, caffeine, fasting, those might be the actual habits themselves. But here I realize, or I want to acknowledge that many people, including myself, are doing some or all of placing those somewhere within this phase 1 of 0 to 8 hours after waking. Now, of course, some of the things I listed out, sunlight viewing, exercise, cold exposure, caffeine, fasting, those might be the actual habits themselves. But here I realize, or I want to acknowledge that many people, including myself, are doing some or all of these things already. And many people, including myself, are trying to adopt new habits that don't fall into the category of just trying to set your overall state. Again, norepinephrine, dopamine, and all these neural systems will be greatly elevated in this 0 to 8 hours after waking. However, the other things I mentioned, sunlight exposure, exercise, cold exposure, caffeine, fasting, if that's for you, or if you're eating during that phase, eating things that contain some or elevated levels of tyrosine, maybe supplementing alpha GPC or L-tyrosine, etc. All of those things further facilitate the neurochemistry and therefore the state of mind that's going to be ideal for leaning into limbic friction and overriding that limbic friction so that you can regularly perform that habit. What we're really talking about here is leveraging neural systems in order to help you make it more likely that you're going to be able to engage and maintain a particular habit. So what I'm referring to as phase 1 of each day is useful for acquiring certain habits, but there are other phases of the day, and those turn out to be useful for acquiring other types of habits. Phase 2, as I mentioned, is about, again, these aren't specifics, but about 9 to 14 or 15 hours after waking. During this phase of the day, because of the circadian shifts in our biology, the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine that's circulating in our brain and bloodstream tends to start to come down, and levels of cortisol tend to start to come down. That's the ideal circumstance. In fact, you don't really want elevated cortisol late in the day. That's actually a signature of depression and anxiety and a number of other unfortunate things. So 9 to 14 hours after waking, dopamine and norepinephrine and cortisol are starting to taper down just naturally, and a different neuromodulator, serotonin, is starting to rise. Serotonin is definitely going to be highest in this second half of the day and tends to lend itself to a more relaxed state of being. Now, of course, I do realize that some people are less of morning people and find that they really come alive and awake in the afternoon, but most people don't fall into that category. Most people feel more alert early in the day, even anxious early in the day, and then as the afternoon progresses, they tend to be a bit more sleepy, a bit more relaxed, a bit more calm. There are certain things that we all can and should do during this phase 2 of each day that lend themselves to a state of mind and a state of body that is going to be beneficial for the generation and consolidation of certain types of habits. What are those things? First of all, as the day goes on, you should try, if you can, to start tapering the amount of light that you're viewing. Now, this doesn't mean putting yourself into dim light at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's certainly not the case. Simply that you want to start tapering off the amount of really bright light that you're getting, unless it's sunlight. Talked about this before on the podcast, but if you haven't heard, viewing the sun as it's at what we call low solar angle, so as it's headed toward the horizon, you don't necessarily have to watch the sunset, although that can be nice, but getting some sunlight in your eyes in the second half of the day can also be beneficial for a number of brain systems and psychological systems. So you can get some sunlight in your eyes, you can certainly have artificial lights on, but you want to start dimming those lights and bringing them actually physically lower in the room, because the neurons in your eye that view the upper visual field, they actually trigger this alertness mechanism in the brain and body. And in the second half of the day, even if you're humming around and doing work at 3 and 4 or 5 or even 7 p.m., you are probably headed towards sleep a few hours later. So things like limiting the total amount of light if you can, things like NSDR, non-sleep deep rest, another thing that I've talked about on this podcast. If you haven't heard about this before, non-sleep deep rest is an umbrella term for things like meditation, for yoga nidra, a very powerful science-supported tool for teaching you how to relax, things like self-hypnosis, which might sound a little kooky to some of you, but actually is a clinically based tool for which there's a lot of scientific literature. If you're interested in that, there's a great free resource called Reveri, REVERI.com. There's a app for both Apple and Android. This is an app that was developed by colleagues of mine and researchers at Stanford School of Medicine. You can do these short 15-minute self-hypnosis scripts, as they're called, that can teach you how to relax yourself. There's even ones for focus, for sleep, for chronic pain. Again, all very strongly supported by quality peer-reviewed literature. So things like Reveri, meditation, things like heat and sauna, hot baths, hot showers. Those are terrific things to do in the second half of the day. They tend to support this serotonergic or high serotonin-like state and lend themselves to more calm and relaxation. For those of you that are interested in supplementation, there's always ashwagandha, which reduces cortisol. Again, peaks in cortisol late in the afternoon and evening are associated with depression, anxiety, and so forth. Ashwagandha is a pretty potent cortisol inhibiting tool. I personally don't use it very often, and I caution people about using it for longer than 2-week periods of time without taking some breaks. You can look up more about ashwagandha on examine.com. There's a lot of terrific literature with links to studies there. But basically, this phase 2 of the day is one in which you're alert you are present, you are working, you are engaging socially, you're cooking dinner, probably paying attention to a number of things, but you should really be trying to taper off your stress level. So how do you leverage phase 2 of the day for habit formation? Well, given what we know about the neurochemistry of learning and memory, given what we know about task formation and its reliance on certain forms of neuroplasticity, the second half of the day is a terrific time to take on habits and things that you're already doing that require very little override of limbic friction. So these might be things that you could categorize in common terms as kind of mellower activities. It might be journaling. It might be that you already are performing music, or I should say practicing music regularly, but that there's a particular type of music that is hard for you, or that you're working on a particular piece of music, or you're trying to learn a language, something that's a little bit challenging, but doesn't require a ton of energy in order to override that limbic friction. The second half of the day is a much better time to do that. Less resistance, as we might say. But of course, resistance has a neural substrate. And the reason for doing those things in the second part of the day, the so-called phase 2, as I've called it, part of the day, is because your ability to override resistance is really diminished in this second phase of the day. Some of you might say, well, wait, I like to exercise in the second half of the day. That's actually when I have the most energy. That's when I feel warmer. I'm not a morning exerciser. That's absolutely fine. But what I'm referring to is the acquisition of new behaviors and placing those consistently at the second half of the day in order to engage this task bracketing mechanisms that I talked about before. One of the hallmark features of those basal ganglia circuits for go and no-go is that they are associated with certain neurochemicals, dopamine and serotonin, acetylcholine, and other neurochemicals. And by placing particular habits at particular phases of the day, those neurochemical states start to be associated with the leaning in and the process of beginning and, as I mentioned, ending those particular habits. And in doing so, they shift the whole nervous system toward being able to predict that certain things are going to happen at particular times of day, that you're going to be leaning very hard against limbic friction early in the day in phase 1. And that you're going to be doing things that require less conscious override of limbic friction in phase 2. And in doing so, set up this task bracketing system so that the individual habits that you're learning or that you're trying to learn have a much greater probability of being executed and consolidated, meaning that pretty soon they will just naturally become reflexive. And as with phase 1, many of the things that I mentioned that support this, what I'm calling a serotonergic state or a more relaxed state in phase 2, things like seeing sunlight in the afternoon, but not a lot of bright light from artificial sources, things like NSDR, things like heat and sauna, hot baths, etc., ashwagandha. Again, all of those things themselves could be habits that you're trying to adopt, right? In that case, do those if you'd like to explore them. They are quite beneficial for a number of reasons. Not just related to execution of particular habits in phase 2 of the day, but also for improving quality of sleep and consolidating any learning that you might have triggered early in the day. I've talked about that before, but just briefly as a relevant aside, neuroplasticity involves triggering the neuroplasticity, setting it in motion, but the actual rewiring of the brain and the reconfiguration of neurons that will allow that learning to be reflexive, that actually occurs during states of deep rest, like NSDR and like deep sleep. And I should just mention, for those of you that can only exercise or prefer to exercise in phase 2 of the day, right, 9 to 14 hours or 15 hours after waking, that's absolutely fine. However, because of the importance of sleep, and in particular deep sleep throughout the night for not just neuroplasticity, but recovery of muscle and other tissues that are taxed during physical exercise, if you do train in phase 2, I highly recommend that you start doing some sort of NSDR type activity after you train within an hour or two, because that will allow you to taper down and relax so that you can get into the next phase we're going to talk about, which is phase 3. Phase 3 of the 24-hour schedule runs from about 16 to 24 hours after waking. During that period of time, there are a few things that are going to support being in a state of mind, state of body, that are going to allow neuroplasticity to occur, that are going to allow the rewiring that you've triggered during the waking part of the day to actually take place. Those things are very low to no light, meaning keeping your environment very dark or very, very dim. I don't think it's necessary to sleep in a room that's complete blackness. I think that's a little bit overkill. But for most people, keeping the room dark and keeping the room temperature low is very beneficial for getting and staying in deep sleep. The body has to drop by about 1 to 3 degrees in order to get into sleep and to stay asleep. So low light, low temperature environment, you can always pile on blankets, of course, if you don't want to be cold at night. You want to be warm enough, but you want your environment to be cold. Typically, people aren't eating in the middle of the night, although one thing that can be useful is to make sure that you're at least well fed enough when you head into this third phase of every 24-hour day that you're not awake because you're hungry. Now, a lot of people recommend putting a gap between your final bite of food and when you go to sleep at night. Some people say that gap should be 4 hours. Other people say 2 hours. If you're me, I generally have something, I don't know, within 2 hours or 90 minutes of going to sleep, but it's not a big meal. But that's just me, and I fall asleep and stay asleep fine with that. You have to experiment for yourself. I've talked about supplements that can support sleep in previous episodes of the podcast, things like magnesium threonate or magnesium bisglycinate, things like theanine, apigenin. If you'd like to read more about those, we actually have a newsletter that I'll just quickly refer you to. This is the Huberman Lab Neural Network newsletter. You can sign up for it by going to hubermanlab.com. It's very easy to find. But even if you don't sign up, you can go to the toolkit for sleep that's listed there. And that toolkit is not just supplements. That toolkit is a number of different things, both behavioral and supplement-based and nutrition-based, et cetera, that can allow you to get into sleep and to stay asleep more readily. It's totally zero cost. You can find that again at hubermanlab.com. So things like low light, low temperature, the supplements I mentioned, adjusting your eating schedule appropriately, obviously not drinking caffeine in the middle of the night or too close to bed. That's going to be critical. In fact, ideally, you wouldn't ingest any caffeine in phase 2 of the day so that you could get into this deeper state of rest in which habit formation and neuroplasticity can occur. What if you wake up? Right? The way I've cast phase 3 is that you're supposed to be in this deep slumber. You're not supposed to wake up at all. You're supposed to be in low light and your brain is rewiring and those habits are getting consolidated, etc. Well, if you're like me, you probably get up once in the middle of the night. Maybe you go use the restroom. Perfectly normal. But a lot of people have trouble falling back asleep. Very important if you get up in the middle of the night to use a minimum of light in order to navigate your surroundings, just as much as you need in order to safely do so. Because light inhibits the hormone melatonin, can make it very hard to fall back asleep if you inhibit melatonin. The effects of light inhibiting melatonin are actually very potent, happens very, very quickly. So try and keep the lights low. And if you have trouble falling back asleep, that's when you might also want to use something like the Reverie app. They have a sleep script there that can hopefully help you get back to sleep, or something like NSDR. You can find NSDR scripts on YouTube. These are zero cost. You can look up one that I particularly like is NSDR Made For. It's a company I'm associated with, but the NSDR is completely zero cost. And there are other things like Yoga Nidra, which you can find scripts for elsewhere. Again, all of these habits or these behaviors, these do's and don'ts around phase 3 themselves might be habits that you're trying to create for yourself. But again, phase 3 is really about making sure that whatever limbic friction you've been able to override in phase 1 and trigger some new habit, right? Forcing yourself to write or forcing yourself to study or forcing yourself to exercise during that high limbic friction state. And then whatever things you've been doing in phase 2, which are habits that hopefully have moved a little bit further along the continuum of newly formed versus all the way to reflexive, or things that take less limbic friction in order to do. Phase 3 is when all of that gets really locked into the nervous system through those heavy-end mechanisms like NMDA receptors, et cetera, that I talked about before. Again, neuroplasticity is the basis of habit formation, and neuroplasticity and the rewiring of neural circuits happens in these states of deep sleep. So if you're not obeying this phase 3, if you're not giving phase 3 the materials it needs, and you're not avoiding the certain things like caffeine and bright light and stress during phase 3, you're simply not going to be able to build those habits that you've been working so hard to trigger in phase 1 and phase 2 of the day. Again, these are things that I've talked about in previous episodes of the podcast and elsewhere. But really, this is about habit formation. And the whole reason for placing particular types of behaviors at particular phases of the day is to set a framework for that task bracketing. Again, task bracketing and those circuits of the basal ganglia indicate that it's not just the neural circuits that are engaged by the task itself, but the neural circuits that are engaged before and after that task execution. That's what gets consolidated. So when you do things at particular phases of the day, under particular conditions of neurochemistry, what you're doing is you're giving the brain a very predictable set of sequences that during sleep, it can start to put into your hard drive, if you will. It can really program it into your nervous system so that within a short period of time, hopefully within 18 or maybe even 6 days, or who knows, maybe even fewer days, you'll find that executing those behaviors is very, very straightforward for you, and that you won't have to feel so much limbic friction or override so much limbic friction. Some of you are probably asking, okay, if I perform a particular habit during phase 1, and then I do other habits during phase 2, and I eventually get to the point where I'm engaging in those habits in a pretty effortless way, do I keep them in the same phase of the day? And the good news is the literature says it doesn't matter. And in fact, moving that particular habit around somewhat randomly can actually be beneficial to you, because actually moving it from one time of day to the other is that context independence that we really are seeking. By being able to do the same thing that we want to do, regardless of time of day or circumstances, that's how we know that we've achieved a real habit formation. That's how we know that the habit has been moved into certain components of our neural circuitry that just allow us to do it what seems like reflexively. Although earlier I pointed out that these aren't reflexes in the traditional sense. The reason for that is that this brain area, the hippocampus, that many of you know is associated with learning and memory, is not actually where memories are stored. The hippocampus is where memories are formed. It's where procedures, like I talked about before, procedural memory of how you're going to execute a particular sequence, where that's maintained. So like if we use the recipe model, that's where the recipe is maintained until you know how to cook that dish. And then the procedural memory literally migrates off into a different set of neural circuits, which are the neural circuits of the neocortex, where we have maps of sensory experience, maps of all kinds of experiences, including motor maps of how to execute things. So we use one part of the brain to learn something, but then that information in the form of the electrical activity of neurons is passed off to a different brain area. Now, the neurons themselves don't move from the hippocampus to the cortex. That doesn't happen. What happens is the signals, the sequence of electrical firing, much like a script for a movie or the notes on a sheet of paper for a particular musical piece, is transferred off to a different brain area. So that whole process of really leaning into something that's hard, then it becoming easier, and then eventually that thing becoming more or less reflexive, involves a migration of the information in the brain. And once it's migrated out to a different location in the brain, at that point, it's achieved context independence. It doesn't have to be bracketed by, your caffeine and your lunch. It doesn't have to occur immediately after your afternoon NSDR, but before your 4 o'clock meeting on Zoom or something of that sort. So all this is to say that once something has become reflexive, you should play with it a little bit about time of day. If you want to keep it in the same phase of day, great. But if you one day decide you're going to exercise in the afternoon, next day you decide you're going to exercise in the morning, and that's the habit that you're concerned with, that's terrific. If you're able to do that, that means that it's truly achieved context independence. It means that you have officially formed that habit. And as I mentioned earlier, much earlier at the beginning of the episode, the strength of a habit is dictated by how much limbic friction, that was one, and how much context dependence there is. So when it doesn't take much activation energy to get into the execution of that habit, and you can do it in any context, well, then you have formed a habit. We really can't have a discussion about learning anything, habits or otherwise, unless we talk about reward prediction error. Reward prediction error is associated with the molecule dopamine, although I should say there are other neurochemicals in our brain and body that are also related to reward prediction error. But reward prediction error is a very good system, or I should say a lens through which to think about whether or not we should reward ourselves for performing a given habit. And this is a much larger discussion that actually relates to things like parenting and self-regulation. Should we reward kids just for effort? Should we reward ourselves just for effort? What should we reward? How much should we reward ourselves? When should we withdraw reward? Should we use punishment? These kinds of things. This is a vast literature. We don't have time to go into all the details. But the notion of reward prediction error is so powerful that it can predict most, if not all, forms of learning, including habit formation. And you can deploy or use particular features of reward prediction error if you would like to reinforce or accelerate the formation of certain habits. So reward prediction error, quite simply, is if you expect a reward and the reward comes, a particular behavior that was associated with generating that reward is more likely to occur again. That's pretty straightforward. However, the amount of reward in the form of this molecule dopamine that you will experience is even greater if a reward arrives that's unexpected. Okay? So let me repeat that again. If I think that something's coming that's going to be great, that let's say I lean into a habit, I manage to override my limbic friction, and I'm doing my 45 minutes of writing in the morning with no phone and no internet, and I'm getting toward the end and I'm anticipating, I'm actually doing this. This is great. I did it. I'm feeling really, really good. I finish. I definitely will receive a dopamine reward. I'll make my own dopamine reward. That's where it comes from. Remember, this is all internal. However, I will also receive dopamine reward if unexpectedly something positive happens. And typically, if something unexpected but positive happens, the amount of dopamine reward that we get is actually much greater than in any other conditions. However, it's hard to surprise yourself about a behavior that you're deliberately engaging in. So that becomes a bit of a tricky one. Reward prediction error also says that if we expect a reward and the reward doesn't come, that the pattern of dopamine release will follow a particular contour. And that contour is very important. Here's how it goes. Let's say that I'm writing and I'm about 30 or 45 minutes in, and I'm thinking, oh, this is great. I managed to do this. I'm succeeding in executing the behaviors that I need to in order to perform this habit. I'm overriding limbic friction. Just that series of thoughts will start to generate a dopamine release within my brain and body. However, if at the 50-minute mark, the phone rings and I pick up the phone, or I break my own protocol, I break my own self-discipline, and I go on and check social media, or I do something that takes me out of that, what's going to happen is that my level of dopamine is actually going to drop below the baseline, meaning below the level of dopamine I had before I even started the habit execution. Okay? So what this is this is a system that predicts whether or not rewards are going to come. When we think a reward is going to come, it starts to actually arrive earlier in the form of dopamine release. This is the feeling that we experience as in positive anticipation. You tell a kid, hey, we're going to go to the amusement park, or we're going to go get ice cream. They haven't had the ice cream yet. They're not at the amusement park, but they're excited. The dopamine release comes earlier. Okay? They get to the amusement park or they get the ice cream, they will also have some dopamine release associated with that. But most of it, believe it or not, came in the form of the anticipation. And dopamine has some qualities that make the actual ice cream and the actual amusement park experience more pleasurable than it would be had that dopamine release not happen. Now, of course, the other way to do it is to surprise a kid. You tell them, listen, we're going to the class that you absolutely hate, and we're going to go see the person that you absolutely despise, and then you drive them to the amusement park. That's the big release of dopamine. But reward prediction error also says that if you tell the kid or yourself, okay, we're headed to the amusement park, we're going to get some ice cream, they're really, really excited, and then you get there and it's closed, or they're not letting any more people in, well, then the dopamine level drops way below what it was before you told them that you were headed there. Okay? I've given a number of different examples that hopefully make this clear. Reward prediction error governs virtually all aspects of effort and all aspects of learning. Why? Because when dopamine is released in the brain and body, the neural circuits of our brain and body change. There's a state change. Our overall level of energy, but also the sorts of sensory events that we're paying attention to changes when there's a lot of dopamine in our system. Now, you can leverage this for habit formation. Think back to task bracketing. Think back to limbic friction. If you are considering adopting a new habit, or if you are trying to break a habit, something we haven't talked too much about, but we will in a moment, it's very useful to think not just about the procedural aspects of what you're going to do, but also think about the events that precede and follow that particular habit and the execution, or at least the effort to execute that habit. What you're doing is you're casting a kind of a spotlight around a bin of time or a set of events for which dopamine can be associated. What does this look like in the practical sense? Well, again, I'll just try and use very simple, concrete examples, but this could carry over to anything. Let's say I were somebody who has a hard time getting in that 30 to 60 minutes of zone 2 cardiovascular exercise mid-morning. This is actually an issue for me. I much prefer to do resistance exercise than cardiovascular exercise, although once I do it, I always feel much better that I have done it. What I should do is positively anticipate the onset and the offset of that session, right? So thinking about leaning into the effort, going out and doing that zone 2 cardio session, and I should think about how I'm going to feel after. So not just thinking about how great I'm going to feel after, but also thinking about how hard it's going to be at the beginning, and then trying to reward myself subjectively for the entire experience. In other words, start rewarding task bracketing in addition to rewarding the execution of the habit itself. Now, some of you might be saying, well, wait, this is all self-talk. This is just positive self-talk, but it's not positive self-talk. It's not saying, I feel so great about doing something that I actually hate. You can't lie to yourself, or you're welcome to lie to yourself, but the neuroscience literature, the literature of growth mindset, all the literature basically of mindset speaks to the fact that when you lie to yourself, you know you're lying and you actually set up the opposite of a reward system. So you have to be brutally honest with yourself that, for instance, I don't like initiating this cardiovascular exercise, but I do like the fact that I've done it after I've done it. So what you are doing is you are applying reward prediction error to the entire sequence of things that's involved in getting into the habit execution, getting through the habit execution, and getting out of the habit execution. How do you do this? Well, I take us back to our procedural memory visualization exercise that we talked about earlier. When I talked about it in that context, I talked about walking through mentally the series of steps that's required to perform a particular habit. So in the case of the zone 2 cardio thing, it would be, okay, I'm going to put on my shoes, then I'm going to head out the door, then I'm going to drive up the road. There's a particular canyon near here that if I'm going to run, I happen to like running, or I don't hate running enough that I tend to do it. Going through that, heading back, et cetera, et cetera. That's great, but even better would be to broaden the time bin and start to positively anticipate the period headed into the habit. So even before you put on your shoes, the fact that you are successfully placing the habit in this case, phase 1 of the day, and that afterwards I'm going to feel a particular set of positive benefits, elevated mood, etc. I like being hungry, and typically after exercise I'm hungry, so I like being hungry because I like eating. And so there's a whole set of things that link up with one another. So I'm not just thinking about habit execution as this isolated little set of events or this little time bin, but rather I'm drawing a larger envelope around it and starting to positively associate dopamine reward with that larger envelope. And for those of you that are thinking, well, this is just a psychological trick, this is sort of like lying to yourself. It's not, because you're not actually contradicting the fact that some of this is unpleasant. What you're doing is you're taking this entire series of events, what I'm calling this kind of time envelope, and you're associating it with a particular reward that comes later, which for me would be the feeling that, that I've completed this, right? Because for me, that's usually a good feeling. So reward prediction error is beautiful, not just because it's a sort of math of anticipation and reward, or a math of anticipation and disappointment. It's beautiful because you can stretch out or make more narrow the time bins in which reward prediction error works. Reward prediction error is the way in which people navigate four-year degrees, right? I mean, you go, sure, final exam to final exam, et cetera, but ultimately there's a big payoff at the end, and it's all basically for that big payoff. And of course, I understand that it's the journey, not the destination, but let's face it, for a lot of us, goals and habits are about achieving some sort of destination. In the case of zone 2 cardio, for me, it's about trying to stay alive for as long as I can with vitality, that is. And it's also the fact that if I'm doing that, I get to eat the foods that I like. I tend to be able to eat more, which I happen to really enjoy eating, so much so that I like it just as an activity. So basically what you're trying to do is not restrict your thinking to just the habit that you're trying to form, but rather to grab a hold of the timing before and after that particular habit and start to positively associate reward mechanisms in your brain with that entire time bin. This is a very useful and very powerful tool in order to form habits. And I should say that it's not something that comes naturally to most people. In fact, even as I describe it, you might find it's just still a little bit abstract. But what I encourage you to do, if you are finding it to be a little bit vague, would be to pick the habit that you want to form, write down or think about very concretely what is the sequence of steps involved in the execution of that habit, and then write down or think about what is the sequence of events that need to precede that habit, maybe the immediate 10 or 15 minutes before, as well as the immediate sequence of events and or feelings that will occur after that habit, and then call the whole thing a habit execution, the whole thing a effort to engage in that particular habit. And in doing that, and in positively associating with the idea that you're going to complete that entire sequence, you will engage reward prediction error in the proper way that the dopamine surge can lend itself toward motivation. Because ultimately, dopamine is not about feeling good, it's about feeling motivated. This is something that I've talked about numerous times before, but dopamine, contrary to popular belief, is not a reward molecule as much as it is a molecule of motivation and drive. And the natural consequence of doing the exercise I just described, of writing things out that precede, are involved in the immediate execution of the habit and follow the habit, will allow you to experience an increase in energy and thereby an increase in likelihood that you're going to engage in that entire sequence of events. And the reason for that is that dopamine gives us energy. And the reason for that is that the molecule epinephrine, adrenaline, is actually manufactured from dopamine. Biochemically, it comes from dopamine. So dopamine is powerful, and you can access more dopamine around even habits that you haven't yet formed by taking this broader time envelope and task bracketing that specific task execution or habit execution. Way back at the beginning of the episode, I promised you that I would deliver 2 programs that are geared towards habit formation. And I promised that I would give you ways in which you could gauge whether or not certain habits had moved from high effort, what I call high limbic friction, to reflexive. And we talked about a number of ways to gauge that. In researching this episode, I found a tremendous number of different systems for habit formation. It's really amazing how much is out there. There are ones that 60 days to this, or 21 days to that, or 18 days to this. I mean, it's just rampant in the popular psychology literature and in the self-help literature. I want to spell out a particular system that I think could be very useful to most, if not all, people, that's rooted in the biology of habit formation, rooted in the psychology of habit formation, and that is entirely compatible with that phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 type program that I talked about earlier, but encompasses a bit of a longer time scale and really arrives at a kind of a system, if you will, for how to build in habits and then to test whether or not those habits have really stuck and whether or not they're likely to stick going forward. And so this is, at least for sake of this example, a 21-day system. I picked 21 days because that seems to be the average or most typical system for engaging neuroplasticity as it relates to the formation of new habits. This 21-day system actually is one that someone I know very well uses and has used for a long time. They actually use them, their kids use it as well. And it has a certain elegance to it. And I think as I describe it, that elegance will begin to reveal itself. So basically what this involves is you set out to perform 6 new habits per day across the course of 21 days. Why 6 and why 21? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But the idea is you write down 6 things that you would like to do every day for 21 days. What phase of the day those things fall into? Well, that will depend on what they are and how they relate to those earlier phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. But for now, 21 days, 6 things per day. However, the expectation is that you'll only complete 4 to 5 of those each day. Okay? So built into this is a kind of permission to fail, but it's not failure because it turns out that this approach to forming habits is based not so much on the specific habits that you're trying to form, but the habit of performing habits, right? It's the habit of doing a certain number of things per day. So you set out to perform 6. Now, another reason for not necessarily performing all 6 is that some activities probably shouldn't be performed each day. For instance, in my case, if I were to weight train or even run every day, I'm of the sort, or my biology is of the sort, that I don't recover so well. So I wouldn't want to do resistance training every day, but I might want to do it 4 days a week, for instance. So by having 6 things in that list, I could shuffle out that particular activity on particular days of the week and simply do 4 or 5 other activities. So 21 days, you list out 4 to 5 things. So it might be zone 2 cardio, resistance training, sunlight viewing, writing. It could be journaling. It could be learning a language, mathematics. Again, this is going to vary depending on your particular goals and the habits that you're trying to create. But no more than 6, and the expectation is that you're not going to perform more than 4 to 5. If you miss a day, meaning you don't perform 4 to 5 things, there is no punishment. And in fact, it's important that you don't actually try and do what in the literature is called a habit slip compensation, which is just fancy psychological language for if you screw up and you don't get all 4 or 5 in one day, you don't do 8 the next day in order to compensate. This actually brings me back to an example I had from graduate school. I remember when I started graduate school feeling very excited, but a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of things that I had to do because I had to both do research. I was doing coursework at the time. Graduate student stipends, and still now, unfortunately, were depressingly low. So it was financially stressful. There were a number of things happening. And I remember a neurologist, this was at UC Berkeley, a really fantastic scientist and person. His name is Bob Knight. Some of you may know him. I remember I went to him and I asked, what is the process by which someone actually navigates graduate school successfully? And he said, listen, you don't want to do anything or engage in a routine in any way that you can't keep up consistently for at least 5 and ideally 6 days per week. I thought, that's pretty good. And he said, every 4 or 5 years, you might have to update that, but you need to decide what you can do consistently, what you can do every day or at least 6 days a week or 5 days a week. And that was very, very useful to me. And it fits well with this notion of habit slips, that if you happen to screw up and not be able to engage in whatever habits you're trying to learn for whatever reason, that the next day you just get right back on the horse, so to speak. However, there's a really interesting feature from the neuroscience literature and from the psychology literature that says that chunking this 21 days into 2-day bins can be very, very useful. While it is true that the unit of the day that our cells use is a circadian one, a 24-hour clock, there does seem to be something powerful about engaging in particular habits in a particular sequence for 2 days in a row and then resetting. So thinking, okay, I can do this for a day. And if I can do it for a day, I can probably do it for 2 days and then resetting. So every 2 days, you're resetting. So you're kind of chunking this 21 days into a series of 2-day bins in which you are trying to perform 4 to 5 new habits and then completing that 21 days. Now, everything I've described about this 21-day program with 6 things that you're trying to do as new habits and only performing 4 to 5 and not compensating, et cetera, there's nothing neuroscientifically unique about it, except for the fact that it's not just 21 days broken up into 2-day chunks. After 21 days, you stop engaging in this 21-day deliberate 4 to 5 things per day type schedule, and you simply go into autopilot. You ask yourself, how many of those particular habits that I was deliberately trying to learn in the previous 21 days are automatically incorporated into my schedule? How many of them am I naturally doing? In other words, every 21 days, you don't update and start adding new habits. You simply try and maintain the ones that you've built in that first 21 days. And this, I think, is extremely important because in all of the habit literature that I could find, sure, there was a lot of psychological data, neuroscience data, behavioral science data around here's how you form a habit, here's how you break a habit. There was even some kind of tests for whether or not a habit had really achieved context independence, whether or not it was a strongly formed habit. But there wasn't a lot of information, at least by my search, of what to do once you've formed a habit and how to evaluate whether or not that habit is likely to persist long into the future. So here's the idea. You set out these 6 things that you would like to learn or that you would like to acquire in your life, these habits. You only expect that you're going to perform 4 or 5 each day. You do that for 21 days. Again, if you miss a day, you just hop right back on the next day. However, you should think about the functional units within this 21-day period as 2 days. You're going to try and nail 4 to 5 of these things for 2 days. If you happen to get all 6, great, but that's not necessarily required. So you can do it for 2 days, then reset 2 days, then reset 2 days. And then in the next 21 days, you're not trying to acquire any new habits. You're not going to throw in 6 more habits that you want to learn. You're simply going to assess how well, how deeply you've rewired your nervous system to be able to perform those 6 habits of the previous 21 days. And this is extremely useful, I believe, because it will allow you to assess whether or not you can indeed make room, if you even have room, I should say, for more habits, right? Many people are trying to cram so many new behaviors into their nervous system that they don't stand a chance of learning all those behaviors. What you may find is that you kept up 2 of those things very consistently throughout the 21 days. And perhaps there was one of them that you did sporadically, and that there were 3 others that, frankly, you didn't manage to execute. You may also be one of these people, one of these mutants, that sets out to do 6 new things per day for 21 days and performs every single one of them. Terrific. More power to you. In that case, for the following 21 days, let's see whether or not you can continue to perform those very same 6 things every day for 21 days. And then, and only then, would you want to add more habits in. So you could repeat this 21-day process, 21 days of new habit, 21 days of testing those new habits as whether or not they're reflexive or not. You could do that forever if you wanted. But the idea is that this isn't something that you're doing all year long. It's that you, perhaps starting the new year, or regardless of when you're listening to this, you set out to make that 21-day really the stimulus period in which the habits get wired in. And then the following month, and maybe even the following months or periods of 21 days, are really the kind of thermometer or the test bed of how well you've embedded those particular habits. And if indeed you want to continue to add new habits, or you find that certain habits that you weren't able to embed in your nervous system and make reflexive, you want to then bring those in, fantastic. But it's only once you've achieved all those 6 habits as reflexive that you would move forward. And I think this sort of system, while it could have been replaced with many other different systems, again, there's nothing holy about the system, but this particular system has a number of features: the lack of compensation for missed days, the fact that it's a fairly high-intensity program for 21 days, but then you test yourself, a kind of a competition test with yourself, if you will. Those features and the fact that habit slips, missing of particular habits and not doing all 6 is kind of built into the system, I think makes it a very reasonable one. It's very adaptable to the real world. And I think it's one that, provided you obey the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 type system that we talked about earlier, you collapse these 2 programs with one another, which hopefully will be easy based on the descriptions I've given. Well, if you do that, I think there's a very high probability that the habits that you try and form will achieve this context dependence, and that it will take progressively less and less limbic friction to perform them. Thus far, we've almost exclusively been discussing how to form habits. But what about breaking habits? Certainly many people out there would like to break habits that they feel don't serve them well. One of the challenges in breaking habits is that many habits occur very, very quickly. And so there isn't an opportunity to intervene until the habit has already been initiated and in some cases completed. Well, there are a couple of tools that neuroscience and psychology tell us can be very beneficial. Some of those things are somewhat intuitive and relate to what I call foundational practices, meaning things that set the overall tone in your body and brain such that you would be less likely to engage in a particular habit, or that would raise your level of awareness, both of your situation and to how you feel inside. So things like stress reduction, things like getting good sleep, things like quality nutrition, things like having positive routines arranged throughout your day. All of those, of course, will support you in trying to break particular habits. And while that can be very useful, it's admittedly very generic advice. It doesn't point to any one specific protocol. In order to identify a specific protocol that one could apply in order to break habits, we have to look at the mirror image of the sort of neuroplasticity that we talked about at the beginning of the episode. At the beginning of the episode, we talked about a form of neuroplasticity called long-term potentiation involving the NMDA receptor. Just to refresh your memory a little bit, it basically says that if a set of neurons is very electrically active, it's likely that over time, those neurons will communicate with themselves more easily because of changes in things like NMDA receptor activity, the recruitment of additional receptors, et cetera. It's essentially a cellular and molecular explanation for how something goes from unlearned to learned to reflexive. Now, in order to break synapses or to break apart neural connections that are serving a habit that you don't want to engage in, we need to engage the process called long-term depression. And long-term depression has nothing to do with a state of mental depression or a reduction in mood. So I really want to be clear that when I say depression in this context, it has nothing to do with psychological depression. It has nothing to do with mood. It's simply called long-term depression because just as long-term potentiation says if neuron A triggers the firing of neuron B and it does so very robustly over and over and over again, then neuron A will not have to fire as intensely or as frequently in order to activate neuron B in the future because they become potentiated, right? The threshold for co-activation has been reduced. There's a much higher probability that they will be activated together at low levels of intensity. That's essentially what long-term potentiation is. Long-term depression says that if neuron A is active and neuron B is not active within a particular time window, then the connection between neuron A and B will weaken over time, even if they started off very strongly connected. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that because this is pretty detailed neurobiological mechanism whereby if neuron A is active and neuron B is active, but at a different time or outside a particular what we call temporal window, meaning outside a particular time window, then through long-term depression, the connection between neuron A and neuron B will weaken. And just as a point of interest, the NMDA receptor is also involved in long-term depression, although there are other molecular components involved as well. So how do you take two neurons that underlie a habit out of synchrony? How do you get them to fire asynchronously? This is pretty interesting with respect to the cellular and molecular biology, but at the behavioral level, it's especially interesting. The way that one would do this is, let's say, for instance, you have a habit of picking up your phone mid-work session. Okay, that's a reflexive habit I think that most people have experienced. And we often hear the idea that, the phone is so filled with access to dopamine and incredible things that we're just drawn to it. But if you notice what's happened with phone use over time, most people, including myself sometimes, I admit, find ourselves just looking at our phone or find ourselves in a particular app without actually having engaged in the conscious set of steps of, I'm really curious what's going on in this particular app. I'm really curious what's going on in this particular website. And you just kind of find yourself, in air quotes, for those of you listening, I'm making air quotes. You just sort of find yourself doing it because the behavior of picking up your phone is sort of reflexive or has become fully reflexive. You see this a lot at meals where multiple people are there and no one's looking at their phone, and then all of a sudden someone takes out their phone, and you'll notice that other people just naturally take out their phone. It's this kind of observed, observation-induced reflex. And I would wager that most people aren't consciously aware of the immediate steps involved. So the literature says there are a number of ways to break these sorts of habitual behaviors or reflexive behaviors. Most of those approaches involve establishing some sort of reward for not performing the activity or some sort of punishment for performing the activity. I've heard of some basic things that people will do, like they'll even put like a rubber band on their wrist, and every time they complain or every time they do some behavior like pick up their phone, they'll give themselves a snap on the wrist. The rationale there is that you're trying to create a somatic, a very physical representation of something that makes it very real and harder to overlook. Other people will just do a tick mark on a piece of paper, the sort of what gets measured is what gets managed kind of mindset, where if every time you do something, you take away the judgment. This is very new agey, I realize, but this is what you find out there if you search the literature, and even on PubMed, peer-reviewed articles, that every time you engage in a behavior, you just measure the fact that you did that behavior. You just mark it down. At the end of the day, people are supposed to look at that and say, oh my goodness, I can't believe that I spent 3 hours doing something, or I did it 46 times. And in fact, a lot of apps, social media apps,